started boxing at about the age of 7 in Puerto Rico, and then finally moved to Texas. And I continued to box as a teenager. I competed over 100 amateur fights. Turned pro at the age of 17 when I was still in high school as a senior. It was something that I loved. As a fighter, I didn't look for fights. In the streets, if I saw trouble, I walked the other way.
In his 20s, Ramon marries and has 3 kids, but the union deteriorates over time.
I used to travel a lot. I had to go into a lot of tournaments, boxing tournaments around the nation. So it puts a lot of stress on a relationship.
In 2000, after 9 years together, Ramon's wife files for divorce.
When I first got divorced, I was really, really hurt. I didn't want to get divorced. I loved my kids. I wanted to keep my family together.
I grew up with my parents separated. Spent a lot of time with my dad on the weekends for a long time. I was his only little girl.
His children are his life. They're gonna come first. But I think he was ready to enjoy himself.
On a beautiful summer evening in 2007, Ramon heads to Mi Luna nightclub.
This guy had told me about this restaurant in the Woodlands, which is a neighborhood north of Houston. In the evening, they played live music. I pulled out a little Versace sweater that I had, thought it was like cool, looking nice. And I went out there, the place was packed, and I noticed this beautiful lady on the dance floor. She had long black hair, beautiful skin. I remember her wearing a tight black mini dress and high heels. She was a knockout. Next thing I know, I see her coming towards me, and she steps on my toe. I just went down in pain. She started telling me, I'm sorry. I'm saying Spanish, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, step on you, all that. And all I could do is look up at her and just say, would you dance with me? So she kind of asked me what I did, and I told her that I work with kids and use boxing as a tool to keep kids on the right path. And she loved it. She said, oh, wow, that's excellent, man. You're helping kids, and I love boxing.
Maria Durantes, nicknamed Lulu, tells Ramon that she came from Mexico with her 2 children, Luis and Carla. She cleans houses to support her family.
She knew how to work hard so that she could make a living to better her life and her kids' life in this country. And I was very impressed by that.
He seemed happy. He's got this big old smile on his face all the time when she's around. I liked her a lot. I wanted to have her body. What do I have to do to look like that? And we got along fine.
As a man, you want to be treated right, and I treated her right too. It would just go way above and beyond for me. Put it this way, I get up in the morning, she had my full breakfast set on the table. I was her king.
My mother loved it. Someone's taking care of her son.
It progressed pretty quick because she started supporting me a lot in boxing. We dated for about a year and a half. And I was beginning to think, this is the right person for me. The day that I asked her to marry me, I went down to one knee, pulled the ring out of my back pocket, and she just started crying. And I asked her to marry me. And of course, she said yes. And she was so happy that I asked her to marry me. I proposed to her on that weekend, and the following week she was already making arrangements for our marriage.
We had no idea he was getting married. We didn't even know he was gonna propose to her. I knew nothing about it. So that was like a gut punch. And I remember crying, and I was like, what?
We got married at the courthouse in Montgomery County. And then after that, we had a get-together at my sister's house. My older sister, Mari, she opened up her house for a celebration of our wedding. It was great having everybody over. The mother had cooked Puerto Rican food. We danced, and she danced with everybody, and her kids were there. Her mother, her brother-in-law, her sister. It was a great night of partying and celebration.
But not for everyone.
We all decided not to go. We were not interested. Nobody was happy about it. So my brothers and I stayed behind.
No, my kids did not come to my wedding. That was very difficult for me. I can't blame them for anything. It was all my fault. At that time, Lulu was starting to put a wedge between me and my kids.
It was a warning sign, but not the only one.
One red flag in hindsight that bothers me was the day of our marriage at the courthouse. Her mother came up to me and gave me a hug and just whispered in my ear, "Now she's your trouble," and walked away. And I didn't think much of it, but she was trying to tell me something from the beginning.
In 2010, Ramon and Lulu opened a gym together, Woodlands Boxing and Fitness.
Hi, my name is Ramon Sosa.
I am Lulu Sosa.
Welcome to Woodlands Boxing and Fitness.
I always wanted my own gym, and I had a vision on how to run it, where it could be prosperous. She wanted our business to be successful, and she would tell me, you know, I'm not stopping until we make this thing work smoothly and we're making money. It was all 100%, let's do this and support each other.
He put a lot of energy, blood, sweat, and tears into that place.
I had a day job too, but then always had time for the gym because that was my biggest thing. We had to work during the day, and then training people till 8, 9 in the evening.
He was also, you know, living out his dream. He had this so-called beautiful wife, he always would say, and, you know, he had it all.
We bought a big house, 2-story home. We had nice toys, and financially everything was great. And those were the happy times when she saw all the money. She was very, very mindful of everything that was spent. I mean, every receipt had to be accounted for, everything. When it came to spending money on her and her kids, there was never an issue. But when it came to me spending anything on my kids, I don't know what it was that bothered her so much about Mia, that she just hated that every time I brought her into conversation. Mia was competing in a pageant Miss Teen San Antonio. When I told Lulu that I was going to buy a dress for her and I told her how much it was going to cost, oh my gosh, she just went through the roof. She said, well, why are you spending all that money on her for? She's not going to win anyway. I mean, who would say something like that, you know? After our 3rd year of marriage, she applied for her American citizenship. And I remember going to the immigration office and signing a bunch of papers so that she can become an American citizen, her kids, and she even applied for her mother. So they were all becoming American citizens because of me. One afternoon, I get home and I see all these American flags and, you know, it looks like there was a little party at the house. And she says, say hello to your new American citizen wife. And I was so upset. I said, wait, you mean to tell me that you guys had the celebration and you didn't invite me? I would ask her very bluntly. So let me get this straight. You came to this country for one reason only, to become an American citizen and become prosperous, get money, and now that you have it, you know, you don't need me. She says, look at me. I'm beautiful. I can get any man I want, but I picked you. I picked you because I love you. I love everything about you. I could have had any man I want.
Now that I think about it, they were probably having issues. And he said, let me just take her on a trip to make her happy.
Ramon takes Lulu on a vacation to Puerto Rico to show her the island.
We having a good time. This particular evening, we were on the bed at the hotel. We were having drinks. She was going through the social media and she sees a picture of my daughter, Mia. And she made a comment of, you know, look at your daughter looking like a prostitute. I was like, what did you just say? She kept saying, well, look at her. She was like a little prostitute the way she's dressed.
They get into an argument, but to the point where, you know, I'm gonna call you mother. Nothing she says to my mother is gonna upset her, but it upset Ramon that, you know, why are you bothering my mother with this?
And she calls my mother, and I grabbed the phone away from her, saying, no, hang up the phone. I hang up the phone. And what does she do? She runs out of the room.
A few minutes later, there's a knock on the door.
So security comes up and asks what's going on. And then I see Lulu outside our door, the room door. I look at her and I see that she has scratches on her hands and stuff. And I'm like, what happened to you? And I see that look in her face that she's up to something. There's something going on.
Lulu has made her first move in a high-stakes battle with Ramon that will put his life on the line.
She had a plan. From the very beginning, I believe she had a plan. She wasn't going to give up easy.
She just knew how to manipulate people so easily, and I fell for it.
On vacation in Puerto Rico, Ramon Sosa is reeling. His wife Lulu complains to hotel security that he physically abused her during an argument.
The guard stayed with me inside the room. He wanted to hear my version of the story while Lulu was outside with the other security guard. And the security guard that was with me in the room said, one of you guys is gonna have to sleep in a separate room tonight. And I never forget him telling me, watch out for that lady. The next morning after we had that incident in Puerto Rico, I was in the lobby and then Lulu walked up to me and she had her luggage and I noticed that she had some kind of paper and envelope and she showed me that it was a report that she had written out of what happened the previous night. And I looked at it and I was very, very, very upset because it was all a lie. She was just trying to get me in trouble. In the plane, we were sitting next to each other, and I never forget, she fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, and then she had her hand crossed on her lap. I would just stare at her hands with those scratches, and I'm like, this is one crazy lady, you know?
I think Ramon is one that always puts a good face to everything, and he wanted to make this work. He tried his best. I could see him putting a lot of effort into, things working out. I just saw more tension, less smiling, less getting together with everybody. And you could tell, you can see her facial expression that there was higher tension. Ramon too, you could see that they were trying to avoid each other.
Holding on to hope for his relationship, Ramon books a second vacation, this time to Mexico, so he and Lulu can visit her family.
She had detailed every location that we were supposed to go to, and she had specific places that she wanted to take me. There was one particular location that she had on the itinerary, a place called Tepito.
Ramon has never heard of Tepito, but he gets a gut instinct that it's a place he shouldn't visit.
Tepito, in Mexico City. Arguably the most dangerous black market in the world.
She told me that it was a location where there's a lot of poor people that live there, but you can find anything you want. There's a lot of knockoffs that people make there, and they're very cheap. And I was like, but why do you want to take me there? And thank God that we never went. And later on, I understand why.
Back in Texas, things go from bad to worse as the fighting continues.
I was at home with her son, and we got into a back and forth. He had issues. He had a lot of issues with school, misbehaving and getting in trouble, hanging out with the wrong kind of people. So I was very, very tired of his shenanigans. I never put a hand on him, but I got very, very close to him, and it was on his face, and he just broke down, started crying, and went upstairs to his room. Later on that afternoon, Lulu walked into the house. I was just watching my boxing match, and out of nowhere, she throws a right hand. In boxing, we have this saying that the punch that hurts the most is the punch that you don't see. She busted my lip. I believe she was looking for me to retaliate, to find a way to have me arrested or some kind of way have me taken out of the home, but I wasn't gonna hit her. So I just went to the bathroom and just stared at myself, looking at the blood, coming down the side of my mouth, asking myself, what kind of relationship have I gotten myself into? And I believe that she just was using me, and there's no other way of putting it. And once she found a way to get, everything she wanted from me, and as quick as she did, she said, I don't need you anymore.
From here, things escalate quickly.
She started to spread false rumors about me to members around the gym, telling them that I was abusive, physical, mental, abusing her kids, that I was a drunk. And then she's telling parents of kids for my nonprofit, don't believe everything that I say. I'm embezzling money. I'm not what they think. It was just enough, for me to say, you know what, this is not gonna work out. So finally, February 2015, I get served with divorce papers.
What's worse, Lulu still shows up at the gym every day.
Even though we were working in the same gym, and it was like oil and water.
Just when Ramon hits his lowest point, he reconnects with an old friend from the gym. His name is Mundo.
He wanted to be a boxer when he was young or be involved with boxing, but he never had the opportunity. He lived in the east side of Houston at the time when he was young, growing up, and he got involved with gangs. Then later on, he was in prison. But he's a very, very tough guy, but when he came out of prison, he wanted to change his life. And when he became part of my team with the kids at the gym, the kids loved him. He changed his whole life around.
My dad, he would pick us up from school and then take us to the gym. That's how I met Mundo. He was just one of the guys my dad trained. I mean, he would talk to us, he was nice.
I think Mundo is someone that's real grateful to what Ramon, did for him in the time that he was having difficulties. He appreciates the help Ramon gave him and the guidance.
But Lulu is about to test the limits of Mundo's loyalty.
She started helping us on the weekends. Once she found out how beneficial he was to us, she started liking Mundo. Lulu starts having a lot more conversations with Mundo.
It got his ears perked up when he starts hearing Lulu making fun of Ramon and, saying all kinds of ugly things about Ramon.
I was driving home this particular morning and I get a phone call from Mundo. I answer it, I said, hey, what's going on, Mundo? And Mundo says, hey, Pops, I got some hard news for you. Lulu wants you dead. Mundo overheard Lulu's daughter telling Lulu that there was a kid in the gym that has a family member in Mexico that kills people for money. And Lulu responded by, maybe we can use him. Mundo walked up to Lulu and asked her, you mean you want him to go away like this? He made the pistol sign. You want him to go away like this? And she said, yeah. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I got the people that can do the job. And she said, okay, let's talk.
But Mundo has a plan, and after they talk, he calls Ramon.
He said, all I'm gonna do is just have conversations with her, meet with her, and record everything and see how far she's willing to go with it.
Ramon and his wife have been having difficulties. She called the police out there several times alleging domestic violence. And he called me one morning and said, Lulu's trying to find somebody to kill me. I had seen enough of this lady by that point to take this very seriously. My advice was hang up right now and call the sheriff, which he did.
I made an appointment with the sheriff department and talked to a deputy, and he basically said to me that, look, that's not enough evidence, you guys are going through a divorce. She could be saying that just out of being upset, with you. But if he's recording her and bring all those recordings in, and then the DA can make a case out of it or find some kind of cause. But right now it's just your word against hers.
Mundo starts recording, you know she was making plans about life insurance. It's all greed. It's all greed. When I heard those tapes, I'm like, I can't believe it. I'm in shock.
There was one recording where she's laughing with Mundo and giggling, telling Mundo, like, hey, this is how I'm gonna cry when the police comes and tells me that he's dead. And she starts giggling. So she's already practicing how she's gonna cry. And another one that really bothered me was about the trip that we took to Mexico. She tells Mundo that the plan was that we were supposed to get abducted and they were gonna let Lulu go and they were gonna hold me for ransom and then take me away. The place where everything was gonna happen was gonna be in Tepito, a place that I didn't want to go to.
You know, I've seen the pictures. They seem very happy. But as I heard in one of the recordings, she mentions that she just didn't have the heart to disappear him while they were in Mexico.
And here I was having a great time with her family. And in her head, she was trying to find a way to have me killed. And this lady was very, very, very evil. Mundo came to the point where he had to ask her for money. He said, I'm gonna ask you for money for a gun to commit the crime. And I'm also gonna let her know that I have the people that are gonna do the job.
¿Qué pasó, Lulu? Nada, pues nomás ellos, bueno, con lo que usted ofreció, pues de perdido saben que todavía está en serio que quiere que lo maten, todo también.
Sí. No, sí, definitivo. O sea, de que se lo echen, que se lo echen. No vale madre, eso, ¿no? Y de que les voy a pagar.
Now, Ramon is pulled into Mundo's plan.
Mundo told me, look, I need you to go buy a burner phone and we're gonna text back and forth and Lou's gonna think that you're the hitman. He told me, how to talk gang, that language that they talk. And that's what we did back and forth. I texted to her, are you ready? I need the money. I need at least $200 to buy the toy. And she said yes. It was intense. And the whole time she had no idea that it was me. And once Mundo got the $200, we thought that was enough evidence to take to the local police. When I told them the story, they separated us, me and Mundo. They heard his side of the story, they heard my side.
The Houston police bring Ramon and Mundo's evidence to the prosecutor's office.
I first heard about this case was when the Precinct 3 Constable's office came to set up a meeting with me to talk about it. Ramon had come to them and reported that his wife, Maria Sosa Lulu, was trying to kill him, that they felt that Ramon was credible. Ramon had some audio recordings between Mundo and Lulu. Anything that Ramon or Mundo brought us, a jury or a judge is going to actually involved in the case, who has every reason to be lying or who has every reason to set Lulu up.
Prosecutor Blackburn decides to reach out to the FBI.
They assign an FBI agent to work on the case with us. They have an officer that they want to use to do the undercover work that has experience doing it. He's a Spanish speaker. He looks the part. He plays the part. But not only that, they have all the equipment. They have the undercover equipment, the cameras, the microphones that you need, the vehicles, and the surveillance teams that you need when you run one of these operations. Until we can actually have Mundo introduce our hitman to Lulu and see what she does and see if she actually even participates, we really don't know what we have at this point. Once that did happen, it was a very quick meeting in the parking lot of an academy. Mundo and our undercover officer drove to the academy. There was about a 10-person surveillance team that was surrounding them, set up all over the parking lot. Mundo gets out and goes and speaks with Lulu. Everything's being recorded. Everything's being videotaped. It is a very fluid situation. Once they make contact with the target and they're speaking with them, you don't know how it's going to go. You don't want to entrap the person. So you have to be able to determine, is this someone that really wants this done? Or is this just a scared lady who doesn't know what to do and is at her wit's end because law enforcement hasn't helped her in the past? Does she really want him killed, or does she just want him beaten up? Does she just want him scared? Our undercover was a big guy, long black hair, tattoos. She loved talking to him. You could tell she was flirting with him. It wasn't something that she was uncomfortable with at all. He asked her straight out, do you want us to just beat him up? Do you want us just to scare him? Because we can do that. Her automatic response was, no, he's making my life miserable.
Este güey lo quieres madreado, o quieres que lo quieres acabado, lo quieres muerto, o quieres que nos hagamos una putiza.
No, a mí me sirve más muerto que estar poniendo la vida.
Once we heard that, we knew that we were dealing with someone who really wanted her husband dead. Well, what makes this a solicitation of capital murder versus a solicitation of just murder is that you're willing to pay someone to kill Ramon. So we had to have what's called remuneration. Something of value that Lulu was willing to give in order to have Ramon killed. In this case, the CI asked what she had. She was able to give us watches, keychains, a diamond-studded boxing glove of Ramon's. She offered to let us have Ramon's truck after we killed him. And then she even went to the ATM and got out, I believe it was $1,000 out of the ATM, and gave it to us. So at that point, she'd committed the offense.
Lulu wanted me dead as soon as possible. Her intentions were that I was murdered before the divorce was finalized, or else my kids would get everything. So she wanted me dead soon.
A lo mejor ellos dicen, ¿sabes qué? Ya, firmamos el divorcio. Ese es el problema.
Entonces lo quieres rápido, entonces.
Lulu Sosa has just crossed a line by offering money for a hit on her husband. But the prosecution wants an airtight case.
So one of the big hurdles that you always have in these type of cases, once you get them into court, is the defendant now saying, look, I never meant for this to happen. I was scared once I got myself involved. I didn't know what to do. And in this case, your defendant's not a 6'5", 250-pound man. It's a small, petite, attractive female who's going to look good in front of a jury.
They told me, here's the deal, Ramon. Right now we have enough information, enough evidence to arrest Lulu. But the thing is that, she's a beautiful lady. She's a mother. She has never been in any trouble. And we don't want to take any chances of going to a jury trial and have one of the jurors feel sorry for her. We need this to be a slam dunk case.
Prosecutors tell Ramon that they need him to do one more thing to secure their case.
Depending on who your victim is and who your target is, you can stage their murder. I always want to try to put a photo that's a staged photo of their loved one in front of them to see what the reaction is.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, repeat that again? You're gonna take a picture of me dead. How is that gonna work? And he said, we're gonna put some makeup on, take a picture, and then we're gonna show it to her and record it. And that's gonna be the evidence that we're gonna show the jury, her reactions. They told me, I need you to go home and get clothes for 3 days because we're gonna hide you. We don't wanna take any chances of anybody knowing where you're at.
Reluctantly, Ramon Sosa agrees to stage his own death.
I find out that these guys have looked up how to make bullet wounds from a YouTube video they had watched the night before. And I couldn't believe it, but they made it look right.
I remember traveling to the actual gravesite that the authorities had already dug up to take the picture of me dead, thinking in the back of that SUV about my kids, my mother, my father, my family, how upset they were gonna be once they found out that I had to fake my death so Lulu can get arrested. When they put me inside of the grave, they told me to put my hands behind my back, close my eyes, put my head at an angle where they can take pictures. And they even threw dirt on top of my head. I thought that was demeaning too, but That's what they had to do to look as real as possible.
2 weeks after first meeting, the undercover agent again meets up with Lulu, this time to provide proof of Ramon's death and record her reactions.
So it's just our undercover driving to the same location. We pull up, she jumps into his car, she's not scared, she's not upset, and he tells her that they were able to do it successfully. She asked him specifically, did he fight back? Was it painful? Was he scared? So they talk a little bit about the murder itself, and then he shows her the picture on his cell phone, and she starts smiling. And as she's about to leave, she says, he's really dead, he's not getting out of that hole. And our undercover told her, no, he's not, and that's when she basically raised the roof with her hands. I've never seen someone that joyous. When Lulu realized or believed that Ramon was finally dead, the expression that she had and what she did and how she acted, I've never seen that before.
I just happened to answer the phone at the office at the time that she called, and she said, Noris? And I was like, who is this? She goes, this is Lulu. And she says, I'm calling because a coworker of your brother's called me and told me that they haven't seen him, he has not been at work, and that's just not like him. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then, I started texting my brother and texting him and calling him. He would not answer, he would not text me back. Kind of started getting worried. Like, okay, what's going on? And then finally I told one of the managers, I said, look, I need to go home. I have an emergency. And by the time I got over there, the police, the ambulance, and everybody was there. We're like, okay, what happened?
That afternoon, detectives go into the boxing gym. They were investigating a missing persons report. And if she had any information about where he might be, just to see what her reaction would be and how she would act.
Okay, Detective Martinez, the counsel's office. I had a few questions for you. Is there somewhere we can talk in private?
Sure, absolutely.
The evidence that we're getting is so we can show a judge and a jury how manipulative she is, how cunning she is, how cold she is, and how good of a liar she is.
Mr. Sosa hasn't been at work today?
That's what they told me. I received a call today from Byron, and that's his friend.
His friend at work?
At work.
Okay. When's the last time you saw Mr. Sosa?
She now knows that she's standing in front of two detectives. They're questioning her about her husband's disappearance. That's the first time you see her getting rattled, getting nervous, shuffling through papers.
Wednesday 15th, the last day.
That's the last time you saw him?
That's the last time I saw. Then I contact Noris Kenya. This is Ramon's sister. This is her number, but she hung up on me. Like,
this is his sister?
Yes.
Okay.
It's like, hey Noris, listen, Byron called me this morning. So I just...
She's still playing the part.
Okay, Ms. Sosa, stand up, please. You're under arrest. Okay, you're under arrest.
Why?
Ma'am, it's okay. No, vamos a
Háblale a Julio, por favor, está.
Ramon Sosa is still in hiding when he gets the news from the police.
Then I got the call. They had arrested her. And when I got that call, it was a mixture of emotions. I sat on the edge of the bed, and tears started coming down my eyes, and I couldn't explain why. I don't know if there were tears of happiness or tears of anger.
Ramon's family is still in the dark and has no idea where he is.
Ramon never told me what the plan was. So I'm like, why is she looking for Ramon? I start calling Ramon, paging Ramon, he's not calling me back. I'm starting to really worry.
They brought me back to the police station. My story was headline news. in Houston.
Hitman to kill her husband.
Who, the investigators he was working with, Sosa met with the undercover agent again.
As soon as I got, my phone back, I tried to call my mother.
There was breaking news on TV with Lulu's face on it saying hired to kill in Montgomery County.
41-year-old Maria Sosa is behind bars after deputies say she tried to hire a hitman to kill her husband.
My mom was hysterical.
And my father answered the phone. And in the background, I could hear my mother crying. Just, the kind of cry you hear at funerals. And it was very difficult to hear my mother, the way she was just crying and crying. She thought that Lulu had killed me.
And then everybody started coming, and my brother got there, and he started crying, and then Mundo got there.
When my mom saw Mundo come in the door, she just ran to him, hugged him, and thanked him, and she was saying to him, thank you so much, Mundo, for saving my son's life.
The Sosa family rejoices in the moment, but is Ramon truly out of danger? No one knows if Lulu will send someone else after him.
For the next few weeks, I would sleep in my own bed with a loaded shotgun, and I had a 9mm gun loaded in my vehicle. I was like a ticking bomb at all times. I didn't know what to expect. I was very, very upset, and anything could set me off. I was afraid of myself, to be honest with you.
The next ordeal for the Sosa family is facing Lulu in court.
So once she's been taken into custody and charged with solicitation of capital murder, now the prosecution of her happens. Her case gets filed into court. Is she going to plead guilty? Is she going to want a trial? And how much time she's going to spend in prison?
I remember going to her first court hearing. It brought me back to how she used to dress all the time when we went out, and how she loved wearing nice clothes, nice heels all the time. She looked, always spectacular. She loved people to notice her when she walked in the room.
Sad to see this beautiful woman in this jumpsuit. It breaks my heart. I don't wish that on anybody, to see somebody all chained up like that.
So after the defense came and was able to review all of the evidence against her, they came asking for an offer. And we were eventually able to agree to allow her to plead to solicitation of murder and receive a sentence of 20 years in prison.
There's so much evidence against her that if she would have tried to go to a jury trial, I think she would have received life in prison. She never looked at me once. In all the hearings that I went to, she never looked at me once. Her last hearing when she was sentenced, the judge let me speak. And I remember saying to the people that were there, nobody in here is perfect. We have all made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. And I told Lulu, I forgive you. I told her, I forgive you.
I just couldn't believe that he was saying that he could forgive her and that he was gonna be okay and that he's gonna move on. And how do you say that to somebody who just planned to have you murdered? But that was his way of moving forward, and that helped me move forward as well.
Once I forgave her, I was able to walk out of that courtroom in peace. The last thing I remember was the sound of the chains as she walked away.
Ramon's done a really good job of working with the Pro Board and with the Texas Department of Corrections and protesting her parole on multiple occasions. She has not received parole, and she's still in prison. Hopefully she's learned her lesson. The likelihood that she'll do it again or try to do it again is very minimal, but you never want to say never.
After Lulu was arrested, people were scared to come back to the gym, so the memberships dropped tremendously.
In 2017, Ramon closes the gym and files for bankruptcy. But even losing his dream doesn't dim his enthusiasm for his new life.
I was able to write a book. I walked to my own grave. It has also helped me a lot. Writing that book, it's been great to use my story for something positive. And that means a lot to me now.
My relationship with my kids is a lot better now. With Mitchell, with Chris, and with Mia. I try to talk to them just about every day.
That wedge that Lulu created between us, it was very difficult. And again, I can't blame nobody but myself. It hasn't been easy, but it has gotten a lot better.
I have 3 grandkids now. They're my life.
He's doing so much better, and he's so happy. His best is yet to come.
I am wonderfully in love with someone now. I'm engaged. Life is great for me now.
And I will forever, ever be indebted to Lulu.
It begins with a sound no one remembers clearly anymore, a metallic click swallowed by the Florida night, the kind of noise that never makes it into police reports but lingers in the back of the mind, the kind of noise that feels wrong only years later, when people start asking how a woman could vanish without a scream, without a witness, without a trace, and how an entire town could sleep through it. The road was quiet that night, humid air pressing down on asphalt, streetlights flickering like tired eyes, and somewhere between a blinking yellow signal and a convenience store that never closed, a life slipped sideways into a cold case that would haunt investigators for decades. In the spring of 2001, this stretch of Florida was the kind of place people believed bad things happened elsewhere. Palm trees swayed, lawns were trimmed, neighbors waved from driveways. Crime existed, but it was distant, boxed into headlines from Miami or Jacksonville. Not here, not on these streets where kids rode bikes past dusk and unlocked doors were a habit no one questioned. When the missing person call came in, it sounded ordinary. Too ordinary. An adult woman, late 20s, didn't show up for work. Her phone went to voicemail. Her car wasn't where it should have been. At first, officers treated it like a delay, a misunderstanding, maybe a fight with a boyfriend, maybe a spontaneous drive to cool off. Florida had a way of swallowing hours, then days with sun and heat and excuses. The house told a quieter story. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No blood. No chaos. Her purse sat where it always did. Keys missing. Shoes gone. The bed looked slept in, but not rushed. Coffee grounds in the filter, untouched. It was the kind of scene that unnerved experienced detectives because it refused to perform. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just absence. The most dangerous evidence of all. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering, speculating, replaying the last time they had seen her walking the dog, checking the mail, smiling without knowing it would be the final impression she left behind. As the hours stretched, the language changed. From missing to concerning. From concerning to suspicious. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, gas station windows, school bulletin boards. Her face stared back in black and white. Eyes caught mid-expression. A photograph taken years earlier when no one imagined it would become a symbol. Tips came in fast and unreliable. A woman who looked like her at a rest stop. A scream heard late at night that could have been anything. A car matching a vague description that turned out to be nothing at all. Investigators logged each call, each rumor, watching the case swell without deepening, like water spreading thin across concrete. The first real jolt came days later, when her car was found. Not abandoned in a dramatic place, not burned, not stripped. Just parked. Clean. Locked. As if someone had borrowed it and returned it carefully, respecting the rules of a life they had already disrupted. Inside, nothing screamed violence. No fingerprints that didn't belong. No obvious signs of a struggle. The trunk empty. The gas tank half full. It was a discovery that should have brought relief, but instead it sharpened the fear, because cars don't park themselves, and people don't vanish politely. Detectives began retracing her final known movements, building a timeline out of receipts, phone records, half-remembered conversations. She had left work at her usual time. She had stopped for groceries. She had driven a familiar route. Somewhere between routine and home, the line broke. The question that gnawed at everyone was brutally simple. Where could someone intercept her without leaving a mark? Florida roads were busy, but they were also anonymous, endless ribbons where one vehicle blended into the next, where a routine traffic stop was just another inconvenience, not a prelude to disaster. Witnesses remembered police lights that night, or thought they did. Blue and red flashes were common, part of the landscape. No one could say for certain if the lights they recalled were connected, or just memory stitching meaning onto coincidence. Still, the idea settled in, uncomfortable and persistent. What if the moment she disappeared looked official? What if compliance was the trap? Investigators resisted the thought at first, knowing how dangerous it was, how easily it could spiral into accusation without proof. But cold cases are built from questions no one wants to ask, and this one refused to go quiet. As weeks turned into months, the investigation strained against its limits. Search teams combed wooded areas, drainage canals, retention ponds. Divers went down into dark water where visibility was measured in inches. Cadaver dogs traced and retraced paths that led nowhere. Each operation ended the same way, with exhaustion, paperwork, and the heavy silence of a briefing room where no one had answers worth delivering. The community oscillated between hope and dread, clinging to the idea that she might walk back into town one day, changed but alive, while slowly accepting that something irreversible had happened. Media attention surged, then thinned. New cases replaced old ones. Her name slid down the list of priorities, but within the department the file grew heavier. Notes, maps, photos, unresolved leads circled in red ink. A cold case officially now, though no one likes saying it out loud. The detectives assigned to it aged with it, carrying the weight of a woman who never came home, of a night that refused to explain itself. Years passed. Technology evolved. DNA databases expanded. Old evidence was re-examined with new tools and the same old hope. Still nothing. The case became a lesson told to rookies, an example of how disappearance doesn't need drama to destroy lives, how the most frightening crimes are the ones that leave nothing behind. And then, without warning, the past resurfaced in the most mundane way possible. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a breakthrough born of brilliance. It was a routine traffic stop, years later, miles away, the kind of encounter that barely registers in a shift report. A vehicle pulled over. A nervous driver. A name entered into a system that had grown far more powerful than it was in 2001. The screen refreshed. And somewhere deep in a database, a dormant connection sparked to life. Investigators would later say they felt it before they understood it. That cold tightening in the chest when coincidence becomes pattern. When a detail from a forgotten file suddenly aligns with a present moment. A routine stop. An unexpected flag. A question asked twice. The kind of moment that doesn't explode but hums, low and dangerous. The kind of moment that makes you pull an old box from a shelf and blow dust off a case you never thought would move again. Back in Florida, phones rang. Retired detectives were called at home. Files were reopened. Names long dismissed were dragged back into the light. The community, older now, quieter, felt the ripple before it knew the reason. Because some stories never end cleanly. Some truths surface not with clarity, but with unease. And as investigators followed the thread pulled loose by that traffic stop, one question returned, louder than ever, echoing through years of silence. If this was the answer, why did it feel like the beginning of something even darker? The database hit didn't announce itself with sirens or flashing alerts. It arrived quietly, a line of text on a screen that didn't belong there, a mismatch between what was expected and what suddenly appeared. And the officer conducting the traffic stop felt it immediately. That subtle shift in the air when routine fractures. The driver's name wasn't new, but the associations buried beneath it were old, archived, connected to a Florida case most people had stopped remembering. A missing woman from 2001. A cold case that had calcified into legend. The officer didn't know the details yet, only that something from the past had reached forward and tapped the present on the shoulder. The stop itself was unremarkable. A broken taillight. A late hour. The driver compliant, calm, almost too calm, answering questions with the practiced ease of someone familiar with police encounters. No warrants. No immediate cause for alarm. But when the system cross-referenced the name, An internal note surfaced, not a charge, not an accusation, just a marker, a flag placed years earlier by a detective who refused to let go. Person of interest. Florida. 2001. That was all it took. That was enough to slow the moment down. As the officer waited for backup, the past began to reassemble itself, piece by piece, in places far removed from the roadside. In Florida, an evidence locker was unlocked for the first time in years. Boxes were stacked on metal shelves, each labeled in fading ink, each carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Inside one of them was a statement taken 2 decades earlier, overlooked at the time, dismissed as coincidence. A man stopped by police late at night. A minor infraction. His presence near the area where the woman vanished. Nothing solid. Nothing chargeable. Just a name written down and circled once, then buried under louder leads. Back in 2001, investigators had been chasing momentum. Every hour mattered. Tips flooded in, and the pressure to act forced triage. Some leads were followed aggressively. Others were noted and set aside. Victims of limited manpower and imperfect intuition. The man from the traffic stop was one of those. He lived nearby then. He owned a vehicle similar to one reported by a witness who couldn't quite be sure. He had an alibi that held, loosely, just enough to survive initial scrutiny. And so he slipped through the cracks, not innocent, not guilty, just unproven. Years passed, and his life moved on. Addresses changed. Jobs shifted. He crossed state lines. His name drifted away from Florida databases, settling into the anonymity of time. Meanwhile, the woman remained frozen at 28, her photograph unchanged, her absence the only constant. The case file thickened but never moved forward. Cold cases don't go quiet all at once. They fade, inch by inch, until the silence feels permanent. The traffic stop shattered that illusion. When Florida detectives were notified, disbelief came first, then caution. Cold cases teach restraint. Hope can be dangerous. They requested everything. Body cam footage. Dispatch logs. The driver's statements. His fingerprints, now digitized, compared against evidence that had been waiting patiently for technology to catch up. A partial print lifted from the woman's car years earlier, once too smudged to matter, now suddenly worth a second look. As analysts worked, detectives revisited the night of the disappearance with new eyes. They reconstructed the timeline not as it had been assumed, but as it might have been. The grocery store stop. The drive home. The stretch of road where police often sat, watching for speeders, broken lights, expired tags. A place where authority was expected, where compliance was instinctive. A place where someone could pull over without fear, trusting the uniform, trusting the lights. Witness statements long dismissed were reread. One neighbor remembered seeing flashing lights through a window, assuming someone else had been pulled over. Another recalled a woman standing beside a car, hands clasped, posture tense. Details once too vague now took on shape. Investigators felt the ground shifting beneath old conclusions. The unsettling realization that the truth might have been visible all along, hiding in plain sight. The suspect, now older, sat in an interview room miles away, unaware of the storm forming around him. He answered routine questions about the traffic stop, about his destination, about his past addresses. When asked about Florida, his expression changed just slightly enough to register. He said he had lived there briefly. He said it was a long time ago. He said he didn't remember much. The answers weren't incriminating, but they weren't clean either. They carried the residue of rehearsal. Florida detectives flew out. When they sat across from him, they didn't accuse. They listened. They let silence do its work. They asked about 2001, about his job then, about his routines. He spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing, guarding himself behind normalcy. But time has a way of eroding defenses. Small inconsistencies surfaced. A date off by a week. A route that didn't make sense. A pause that lingered too long. For the investigators, the case was no longer cold. It was alive, volatile, dangerous. But solving it meant more than identifying a suspect. It meant proving what happened in the absence of a body, in the absence of a crime scene that screamed violence. It meant building a narrative strong enough to survive court, scrutiny, doubt. And it meant confronting the possibility that the very symbol of safety, the traffic stop, had been weaponized. As forensic results trickled in, tension mounted. The partial fingerprint didn't match conclusively, but it didn't exclude him either. DNA evidence was scarce. Time had done what it always does, degrading, erasing, complicating. The strongest thread remained circumstantial, woven from movements, opportunities, patterns. The suspect had been pulled over multiple times over the years. Minor violations. Nothing alarming. But a pattern emerged in locations, in timing, in behavior that felt predatory in hindsight. Media caught wind of the development. Headlines resurfaced the woman's name, pairing it with the shocking phrase routine traffic stop. The community reacted with a mix of relief and anger. Relief that something was finally happening. Anger that it had taken so long. Questions flooded in. How many others? How could this have been missed? Trust, once broken, is difficult to repair, especially when the breach involves authority. Behind closed doors, investigators grappled with their own doubts. Cold cases are unforgiving. Every mistake is magnified by time. Every assumption is suspect. They revisited every decision made in 2001. Every lead dismissed, every path not taken. Some felt guilt. Others felt vindication. All felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. The suspect was released pending further investigation. Legally, there was no choice. Evidence takes time. But his name was now anchored to the case in a way it never had been before. Surveillance began quietly. Financial records were examined. Old associates were contacted. A former coworker remembered something odd. A comment made years ago. A joke that didn't land right. Another recalled him returning to work late one night, agitated, distracted. Details surfaced slowly, reluctantly, like memories waking from sleep. As the investigation deepened, a grim realization took hold. If the theory was correct, if the disappearance stemmed from a traffic stop, then the crime wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, calculated. The victim didn't scream because she trusted. She complied because she believed she was safe. That possibility haunted everyone involved, casting a long shadow over the case and over every flashing light on a dark road. The night the Florida detectives compiled their updated timeline, the room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. On the wall, photographs were arranged in sequence. The woman's last known image. The stretch of road. The suspect's vehicle. The traffic stop location. Lines connected them, red string against whiteboard. A visual attempt to impose order on years of uncertainty. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The case was no longer asking if something terrible had happened. It was asking how, and why it had taken so long to see it. Outside, life went on. Cars were pulled over. Warnings were issued. Tickets were written. Routine continued, oblivious to the truth inching closer to the surface. And somewhere between the past and the present, between a cold case file and a living suspect, the story tightened, drawing investigators toward a conclusion that promised answers, but threatened to expose something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The deeper investigators pushed, the more the case resisted being handled like a normal investigation, because nothing about it behaved normally anymore. Time had distorted everything. Memories had softened, hardened, or rewritten themselves entirely. Documents contradicted one another in subtle ways. Not enough to scream error, but enough to whisper doubt. Every step forward felt like walking across ground that might collapse without warning. And yet there was no turning back. Not now. Not after the past had reached out through a routine traffic stop and demanded attention. They started with the suspect's movements in 2001, rebuilding his life as it existed then, not as he described it, but as it actually unfolded. Old pay stubs, time cards, rental agreements, vehicle registrations, all dragged from storage or reconstructed through fragments. The man had worked irregular hours, night shifts, overtime, gaps in his schedule that were never questioned at the time, because nothing had seemed wrong. Florida nights are forgiving that way. People come and go. Heat explains restlessness. Late drives don't invite suspicion. One detail stood out almost immediately. On the night the woman vanished, the suspect had clocked out early. Not dramatically early, Just enough to create a window. 37 minutes unaccounted for. In 2001, that gap meant nothing. Now it felt enormous. Investigators mapped it against the timeline they were rebuilding, lining it up with the grocery receipt timestamp, the estimated drive time home, the approximate window when neighbors remembered seeing flashing lights. The overlap wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was close enough to make the room feel smaller. They turned next to his vehicle history. In interviews, he had described owning a sedan at the time, light-colored, unremarkable. Records confirmed it, but something else emerged from an old insurance claim. Temporary replacement vehicles, issued during repairs, cars that never appeared in earlier reconstructions. One of them matched the vague description given by a witness who had called police days after the disappearance, saying she'd seen a stopped car on the roadside that didn't look like a patrol car but had lights. At the time, the tip was filed and forgotten. Now it was underlined twice. Investigators tracked down the witness, now older, hesitant, unsure if her memory could still be trusted. She apologized repeatedly, as if guilt had accumulated over the years. She described the road again, the angle of the lights, the way the scene had felt slightly off but not enough to alarm her. She had been tired. She had wanted to get home. She had assumed everything was fine. When detectives showed her photographs of similar vehicles, her hand hovered before pointing. "That one," she said quietly. No certainty. No drama. Just recognition. Pressure mounted, but prosecutors urged caution. Cold cases collapse when investigators outrun evidence. Everything had to be tested, corroborated, reinforced. The suspect's past traffic stops were reviewed, not just in Florida, but across states. Patterns emerged slowly. He favored certain roads, certain times. Minor violations that justified stops but rarely escalated. Warnings more than tickets. It was subtle. Too subtle to notice without hindsight. But when laid out across years, the behavior formed a shape investigators didn't like. The question everyone avoided saying out loud became unavoidable. Was the woman the only one? Detectives searched for other disappearances, other complaints, anything that fit the pattern. Most came back negative. But one report, filed years later in another state, caused a ripple. A woman had claimed she was stopped by someone she believed to be an officer, only to realize something was wrong when procedures didn't match. She escaped by chance. The report was never tied to a suspect. Until now. That survivor, when contacted, hesitated. Time had taught her caution. But when she agreed to speak, her voice carried the weight of a fear she had never fully shed. She described the lights, the commands, the tone. Calm. Authoritative. Familiar. She described the vehicle, the interior, the way the man avoided answering certain questions. When shown a photo lineup, she didn't point immediately. She studied each face, breathing slowly. Then she stopped. "That's him," she said. The room went still. Even then, it wasn't enough. Identification decades later is fragile. Memory is a living thing, influenced by everything that comes after. Investigators knew defense attorneys would dismantle it piece by piece. They needed something physical. Something that didn't rely on recollection. They returned to evidence once considered exhausted. Fibers from the woman's car. Soil samples. Trace materials preserved more out of protocol than expectation. Advances in forensic science had turned yesterday's debris into today's possibility. The lab results arrived without ceremony. A fiber, microscopic, embedded deep in the car's upholstery, matched material recovered from the suspect's work uniform in 2001. Not proof of violence. Not proof of murder. But proof of contact. Proof that two worlds had intersected when they were never supposed to. Prosecutors leaned forward. Detectives exhaled. The case shifted from theoretical to tangible. The suspect was brought back in for questioning. This time the tone changed. Still calm. Still controlled. But heavier. Investigators laid out the timeline, the gaps, the vehicle records, the witness accounts. They didn't accuse. They invited explanation. He listened, eyes fixed, jaw tight. When the fiber evidence was mentioned, his posture changed. A fractional movement. Enough. He said it meant nothing. Coincidence. He said he helped people sometimes. He said Florida was a long time ago. Then came the silence. Long, deliberate. The kind that tests resolve. Detectives waited. Silence in interviews like this is a mirror. Eventually he spoke again, quieter now. He asked what they wanted. It was the closest thing to a crack they'd seen. As legal teams prepared warrants, investigators returned to Florida one more time, to the place where it all began. The road looked smaller than memory suggested. Narrower. Less dramatic. Cars passed without slowing, unaware of the history pressed into the asphalt. They stood where the woman might have stood, calculating sightlines, distances, possibilities. There was no marker. No memorial. Just the hum of traffic and the oppressive sense that something terrible had occurred in a place designed to feel safe. Search warrants followed. Properties connected to the suspect, current and former, were examined with precision. Ground-penetrating radar. Cadaver dogs. Soil analysis. Days passed. Nothing obvious surfaced. Disappointment threatened to creep back in, but investigators pushed through it, knowing that absence was part of this case's language. Then, in a storage unit rented under an old alias, they found items that didn't belong together. Clothing inconsistent with his size. A set of emergency lights, aftermarket, outdated but functional. And paperwork from 2001 that should have been discarded years earlier. The discovery didn't answer everything. It raised more questions than it resolved. But it confirmed intent. Preparation. A life lived alongside the law, mimicking it closely enough to deceive, but not closely enough to disappear completely. The narrative investigators had feared was assembling itself, piece by piece, no longer hypothetical, no longer distant. News broke in fragments, carefully worded. New developments. Person of interest identified. The community reacted with disbelief, then anger, then a deep collective unease. Parents looked at their children differently. Drivers tensed when lights appeared in their mirrors. Trust, once implicit, now demanded verification. As the suspect was formally named in connection with the case, investigators understood the final challenge ahead. Solving a cold case isn't just about naming what happened. It's about confronting what it reveals. About systems that can be exploited. About the thin line between order and chaos. And as they prepared to take the next step, to move toward charges that would finally put the mystery into a courtroom, one truth loomed over everything else. The case wasn't just about a woman who disappeared in 2001. It was about how easily normal can become lethal, and how long the echo of that moment can last before it's finally heard. The moment the suspect's name entered the public record, the case changed shape again, not in evidence or theory, but in pressure, the kind that bends investigations in unpredictable ways. Phones rang without pause. Former neighbors called in with memories sharpened by hindsight. Journalists circled, hungry for angles, for failure, for scandal. And beneath it all, investigators felt the familiar tension of a cold case warming too fast, the risk that heat, not truth, might crack it open prematurely. They pulled back, slowed the pace, forced themselves to breathe. Because the danger now wasn't losing the case to silence, it was losing it to noise. Inside the task force room, the walls were stripped and rebuilt. Old assumptions came down. New timelines replaced them. Every event from 2001 was re-entered, not as fact, but as hypothesis. Nothing was sacred anymore. Not the original conclusions. Not the early alibis. Not even the belief that the woman had been taken immediately after the traffic stop. Investigators allowed for the possibility that compliance had only been the first step, that the real crime unfolded later, in stages, controlled and methodical. They re-examined the suspect's psychology, not to profile in the abstract, but to understand behavior over time. He had never escalated dramatically. No arrests for violence. No explosive incidents. His record was quiet, almost disappointingly so. But buried within it were small irregularities. Complaints dismissed as misunderstandings. Interactions that left people unsettled, but not alarmed enough to pursue. He blended. He passed. He endured. The emergency lights found in the storage unit became a focal point. Outdated, yes, but fully functional. Investigators tested them at night, recreating the glow, the rhythm, the way they reflected off road signs and windshields. From a distance, from the rearview mirror of a tired driver, they were convincing enough. Not perfect. But perfect wasn't required. Authority only needs to be believable long enough to gain compliance. They brought in traffic stop experts, former officers, trainers, people who understood the choreography of roadside encounters. The conclusion was unsettling but consistent. A lone driver at night, pulled over by lights that looked official, would almost never question it. The risk felt greater in refusing than in complying. The suspect didn't need a uniform. He needed confidence. He needed timing. And in 2001, before widespread dash cams and body cameras, before public awareness campaigns, the road was a place of assumed trust. Investigators turned back to the woman's final hours, now viewing them through this lens. Her phone records showed no distress calls, no sudden spikes. Her silence suggested she didn't perceive immediate danger. That detail, once puzzling, now felt explanatory. She believed she was doing the right thing. Pulling over. Waiting. Answering questions. The compliance wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. As prosecutors weighed charges, they faced a familiar cold case dilemma. Without a body, without a clear scene of violence, they would be asking a jury to accept a narrative built from inference, pattern, and the accumulation of small truths. It was possible, but it would be fragile. Defense teams thrive on fragility. They dismantle timelines. They erode memory. They turn coincidence into doubt. And then another piece surfaced. A retired mechanic, contacted during a routine follow-up, mentioned something offhand, almost apologetically. In 2001, he had serviced a vehicle matching the suspect's replacement car. He remembered it because of the smell. Strong. Chemical. He assumed it was cleaning solution maybe spilled. He hadn't thought about it since. Investigators listened without interrupting, letting the memory unfold naturally. The mechanic recalled the suspect being impatient, hovering, asking how long it would take. The date matched the week after the disappearance. The vehicle was long gone, scrapped years earlier, but the detail landed heavily. It suggested aftermath. Not panic, but control. Not a crime that spun out of control, but one that was managed, contained, erased as best as possible. Prosecutors added it to their growing list of circumstantial weight. Another stone on a scale that was finally beginning to tip. The suspect, now under constant scrutiny, began to change. Surveillance noted shifts in routine. He drove different routes. He checked mirrors more often. He avoided certain places. These weren't crimes, but they were reactions. People who feel nothing don't alter their behavior so precisely. Investigators documented everything, patient, meticulous, knowing that behavior tells stories evidence sometimes can't. When the grand jury was convened, the atmosphere was heavy with restraint. Detectives testified not with certainty, but with honesty. They explained what they knew, what they suspected, and what remained unknowable. They spoke of timelines, of lights on dark roads, of trust exploited. They spoke of a woman who vanished without noise, without witnesses, without justice. The jurors listened, faces unreadable, absorbing a case that refused simplicity. Outside, the community wrestled with its own reckoning. People revisited memories of being pulled over late at night, of trusting gestures, of relief when lights appeared in mirrors. That relief curdled into discomfort. Conversations shifted. Parents warned their children differently now. Trust became conditional. The indictment, when it came, was cautious. Charges tied to kidnapping. Unlawful restraint. Language chosen carefully, avoiding claims that couldn't yet be proven. The absence of a murder charge didn't feel like weakness. It felt like respect for uncertainty. The system acknowledging its limits while still moving forward. The suspect was arrested quietly. No spectacle. No chase. He was taken into custody in daylight, neighbors watching from behind curtains, recognizing his face from headlines that hadn't existed a week earlier. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. His silence followed him, thick and unreadable, into the holding room. As investigators prepared for trial, they understood something fundamental. Even if they succeeded, even if the jury believed them, even if the law finally named what happened, the case would never feel complete. Cold cases don't resolve cleanly. They thaw unevenly, revealing truths alongside scars. And somewhere beneath the legal strategy, beneath the evidence and testimony, one image remained fixed in their minds. A dark Florida road. Flashing lights. A woman pulling over because she believed she was safe. That moment, suspended in time, had shaped everything that followed. And as the case moved toward its most public reckoning, the question that lingered wasn't just whether justice would be served. It was how many years it takes for trust, once broken, to be rebuilt, if it ever truly can be. The courtroom brought a different kind of silence, heavier than interrogation rooms, heavier than briefing halls, a silence shaped by expectation and consequence. When proceedings began, the case was no longer an investigation chasing truth in the dark. It was a narrative under scrutiny, measured word by word, frame by frame, against the rigid architecture of the law. Every inference now had to stand upright without support. Every assumption had to be defended. The past was no longer being reconstructed for understanding, but for judgment. Prosecutors opened carefully, resisting theatrics. They spoke of patterns, not monsters. Of opportunity, not inevitability. They reminded jurors that absence can be evidence when it is systematic, when it aligns too precisely with behavior and timing to be dismissed. They asked the jury to imagine a road everyone thought they understood, and to consider how easily familiarity can become vulnerability. The woman's name was spoken softly, repeatedly, grounding the case in a person rather than a theory. The defense responded with predictability sharpened by confidence. They attacked the timeline. They highlighted the decades between event and accusation. They questioned memory, reliability, motive. They reminded jurors that coincidence exists, that proximity does not equal guilt, that a man's possession of emergency lights proves nothing beyond curiosity or poor judgment. They emphasized what was missing. No body. No confession. No eyewitness to a crime. Doubt, they argued, was not only reasonable, it was unavoidable. As testimony unfolded, investigators took the stand one by one, carrying years of restraint in their posture. They spoke without embellishment, describing how the case evolved, how technology caught up, how a routine traffic stop reopened a door long thought sealed. They acknowledged mistakes, missed opportunities. They didn't defend the past. They explained it. That honesty resonated, even as it exposed institutional vulnerability. The witness who had seen the roadside lights testified next. Her voice wavered but held. She admitted uncertainty. She admitted fear of being wrong. She admitted the guilt of not stopping, not calling sooner. The defense pressed hard, slicing at her recollection, suggesting influence, suggestion, time's erosion. But she didn't retreat. She simply repeated what she knew and what she didn't. That balance, imperfect and human, lingered in the room. Then came the survivor from another state. Her presence shifted the temperature. She described a stop that didn't feel right, an authority that felt rehearsed, a moment when instinct overrode compliance and saved her life. The defense objected, arguing relevance, coincidence, contamination. The judge allowed it narrowly, not as proof, but as context. The jury listened differently now, aware that this wasn't an isolated theory, but a pattern brushing against chance. Experts followed. Forensic analysts explained fibers, probabilities, limitations. Traffic specialists broke down the psychology of compliance. They spoke of expectation, of conditioned response, of how uniforms and lights alter decision-making. None of it accused directly. All of it framed possibility. The prosecution wasn't asking jurors to see a crime. They were asking them to see a system exploited. Throughout it all, the defendant remained still. No outbursts. No visible reaction. He took notes occasionally, leaned toward his attorneys, nodded at strategic moments. His calm became a character of its own, interpreted differently by everyone watching. Composure to some. Calculation to others. Silence as always ambiguous. Outside the courtroom, the community followed every development, parsing updates, choosing sides quietly. Some clung to skepticism, wary of condemning a man without definitive proof. Others felt the case confirmed what they had feared all along. That trust can be weaponized. That evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Conversations grew cautious. Familiarity felt fragile. As days turned into weeks, the case narrowed. Arguments sharpened. The absence of a body loomed larger with each passing session. Prosecutors addressed it head-on, reminding jurors that not all crimes leave remains, that the success of concealment doesn't negate the act. Defense attorneys countered relentlessly, framing the case as a warning against conviction by narrative, by emotion, by the desire for closure. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt compressed by anticipation. The prosecution spoke last, returning again to that Florida road, to the moment compliance replaced fear, to the idea that some crimes succeed because they mimic safety too well. They didn't ask for certainty. They asked for reasoned belief, built from the convergence of evidence, behavior, and opportunity. The defense ended with restraint, emphasizing liberty, caution, the danger of filling gaps with assumption. They urged jurors to resist the pull of a story that felt complete only because it wanted to be. Deliberations stretched. Hours became days. Each juror carried a different weight into the room, balancing empathy against skepticism, intuition against instruction. Outside, the woman's family waited, older now, changed by years of unanswered questions. Closure hovered just out of reach, not guaranteed, not promised. When the verdict finally came, it did not feel triumphant. It felt careful, measured. A partial truth acknowledged by the law. Guilty on some counts. Not guilty on others. The words landed with a dull finality, neither victory nor defeat, but something in between. A recognition that justice in cold cases is often incomplete by nature. Sentencing followed, restrained and somber. The judge spoke of harm done not only to one woman, but to a community's sense of safety. The defendant listened, expression unchanged, as years were attached to actions never fully described, never fully seen. As the courtroom emptied, investigators felt neither relief nor celebration. They felt gravity. The case had moved from mystery to judgment, but it hadn't given up all its secrets. There was still no body, still no final explanation, still a night in 2001 that refused to fully reveal itself. And as the Florida road returned once more to its quiet routine, as lights flashed in mirrors across the state, the echo of that unresolved absence lingered, reminding everyone involved that some cold cases don't end. They simply stop moving. After the verdict, time didn't rush forward the way people expected it to. It slowed, thickened. The case entered a strange afterlife where answers existed on paper but not in feeling, where the law had spoken but the truth still felt partially submerged. For investigators, this was the most dangerous phase, the moment when attention fades and unresolved questions quietly calcify into permanent shadows. The woman was still missing. No grave, no remains, no final location to anchor grief. And that absence continued to exert pressure, not on the courts anymore, but on conscience. Because a conviction without recovery doesn't close a case. It only changes its posture. Behind prison walls, the man who had lived for years beneath suspicion now lived with certainty. He appealed as expected. Motions were filed. Language sharpened. But something else happened too, something subtler. He began to talk. Not to confess, not to explain, but to circle the edges of memory in conversations with counselors, with clergy, with anyone trained to listen without reacting. These conversations were documented carefully, not as evidence but as signal. He spoke of roads, of heat, of Florida nights that never really cooled. He spoke of people trusting systems too much. He never named her, never described an act. But the themes repeated, orbiting a moment he refused to touch directly. Those listening learned quickly that he wasn't haunted by what he'd done, but by how close he'd come to being seen. Investigators reviewed transcripts with a practiced eye, looking not for confession but for fracture. They understood this kind of offender, the type who believes control is its own reward, who measures success by silence maintained. Confession would mean surrendering that control. And so the silence persisted. Meanwhile, cold case units in other states began revisiting their own files. Quietly, methodically. Not because they were sure, but because the pattern demanded respect. Traffic stops. Authority mimicked. Compliance exploited. Incidents that ended without resolution suddenly felt connected by an invisible thread. Most went nowhere. A few didn't. In one jurisdiction, a decades-old missing persons file was reopened. The circumstances were different, the outcome uncertain, but the overlap was enough to raise eyebrows. Investigators compared notes, sharing fragments across state lines, careful not to overreach, careful not to promise families something they might not be able to deliver. Hope, they knew, could be as dangerous as neglect. Back in Florida, the original detectives reflected on the case in quieter moments, away from microphones and transcripts. They talked about the early days, about decisions that made sense at the time but felt brittle now. They talked about how much policing had changed, how technology had closed gaps but also revealed old blind spots. There was no grand apology to be made, no singular failure to point to, just a long accumulation of human limitation. The woman's family navigated a new reality, one defined by partial closure. They visited the road where she vanished, standing where no marker stood, imagining a final moment they would never witness. They learned the rhythms of anniversaries without rituals, of grief without a body to mourn. The verdict had validated their belief that something terrible had happened, but it had not given them the one thing they still wanted most. Occasionally, tips still came in. A hunter who remembered something odd years ago. A construction worker who thought he'd seen disturbed ground once. Each tip was followed, each lead evaluated with care. Most dissolved under scrutiny. A few lingered long enough to reopen old wounds. This was the nature of unresolved cases. They don't end. They echo. Inside the prison, the man's routine stabilized. Days were predictable. Predictability was comfort. But predictability also invites reflection. And reflection can be dangerous for those who rely on control. His conversations grew more abstract. He spoke about mistakes, not moral ones but strategic ones. About underestimating time. About technology catching up. About how systems evolve. Those listening noted it all, filing reports that read more like psychological studies than investigative breakthroughs. One afternoon, during an otherwise unremarkable session, he asked a question that froze the room. He asked whether property ever truly forgets what happens on it. The counselor deflected gently, steering away from implication. But the question lingered. Investigators read it later, and understood its weight. Places remember, even when people don't. Roads remember. Soil remembers. Water remembers. Ground searches resumed in targeted locations, guided by new technology and old instinct. Drones scanned terrain. Radar probed beneath surfaces that had been paved, landscaped, reshaped by time. Each operation was conducted without press, without promises. Investigators had learned the cost of spectacle. They moved slowly now, respectfully, aware that the land might yield nothing, or something too late to feel like resolution. Months passed, then years. The appeal process ground forward, methodical and cold. Some convictions were upheld. Others were adjusted. None erased the central truth that a woman had vanished and never returned. The legal system had done what it could. The rest belonged to memory. In training rooms across the country, the case became a lesson. Not in fear but in vigilance. Officers were taught to explain procedures clearly, to identify themselves unmistakably, to understand how authority feels from the other side of the interaction. Public awareness campaigns shifted language, reminding drivers of their rights, of safe ways to verify stops. Change came, not as an overreaction, but as an acknowledgement that trust requires maintenance. Late at night, on Florida roads, drivers still pulled over when lights appeared behind them. But now sometimes they called ahead. Sometimes they asked questions. Sometimes they trusted their instincts in ways they hadn't before. The legacy of the case lived there, in those small moments of hesitation, those quiet recalibrations of safety. The woman's name appeared less frequently in headlines now, replaced by newer stories, fresher tragedies. But in the files, in the databases, in the minds of those who had chased her disappearance across decades, she remained present. A reminder that some crimes succeed not through violence alone, but through familiarity, through the exploitation of normal. And even as the man aged behind bars, even as the case settled into its uneasy status as solved but incomplete, one thing never changed. The feeling that the truth was still just out of reach, buried not only in earth or water, but in the deliberate silence of someone who believed that withholding the final detail was the last form of control he still possessed. The cold case had been solved, according to records. But the cold never truly left. It lingered in unanswered questions, in empty spaces, in the knowledge that some stories conclude not with clarity, but with restraint, and that restraint, for those left behind, can be the heaviest burden of all. Years after the courtroom emptied and the headlines thinned, the case continued to move in quieter channels, the way underground water reshapes land without announcing itself. It moved through policy meetings and training manuals, through late-night conversations between officers who had pulled too many cars over to count, through the subtle recalibration of what authority looked like on a dark road. The story had become cautionary, but it was also unfinished, and unfinished stories refused to stay still. In Florida, a new generation of detectives inherited the file not as an emergency, but as a responsibility. They opened it with the same care reserved for fragile things, aware that every page had already been handled too many times. They weren't chasing a suspect anymore. They were chasing understanding. Understanding of how a disappearance could pass through so many hands without leaving a bruise. How normalcy could become camouflage. How time itself could be an accomplice. They revisited the geography with modern eyes. Satellite imagery layered over old maps. Development timelines plotted against search grids. Retention ponds that didn't exist in 2001. Roads widened. Shoulders paved. Places that had once been wild reshaped into neighborhoods with names and mailboxes. The land had changed its face, and with it, the odds of recovery. Still they looked. Because looking was the last remaining obligation. One area kept resurfacing, not because evidence pointed there directly, but because it fit the logic of control. Accessible. Temporary. Forgettable. A place where a vehicle could stop briefly without drawing attention. Where movement could blend into routine maintenance or construction. It had been searched before, years earlier, with dogs and flashlights and urgency. Now it was searched again with patience, machines, and a long memory. The ground revealed nothing conclusive. It rarely does when it's been asked too many questions already. Inside prison walls, the man followed the case's distant echo with interest he pretended not to have. News filtered in slowly, distorted by rumor and repetition. He corrected details when others got them wrong, a small tell that never made it into official reports. He spoke about how stories change, about how people need endings. Those listening noted the language. The way he placed himself outside the story while claiming authority over it. Distance was his shield. Control his currency. Occasionally he hinted at bargaining, not openly, not foolishly, but in the abstract way of someone testing leverage. He asked what it would mean for a family to have answers. He asked whether truth always mattered once a verdict was entered. The responses were measured. Investigators had learned that pressing too hard only strengthened resistance. Silence, again, was the terrain. The woman's family learned to live with conditional hope. They attended conferences for families of the missing, listening to stories that mirrored their own in structure if not in detail. They shared strategies for surviving anniversaries, for navigating public interest that flared and faded without warning. They spoke her name often, refusing to let it become a footnote, refusing to let the case be reduced to legal language alone. A journalist, younger than the case itself, requested access to the files for a long-form investigation. Not a sensational piece. A reconstruction. The request was debated, then granted with limits. Transparency had its risks, but so did obscurity. The resulting work traced the case not as a straight line, but as a series of missed alignments, moments that almost connected but didn't. It avoided accusation and focused instead on systems, on how human expectation shapes response. Public reaction was muted but thoughtful. Readers recognized themselves in the story, in the assumption that safety looks official, in the instinct to comply, to keep moving, to avoid complication. The case stopped being about one night in 2001 and started being about how easily trust can be borrowed and misused. That shift mattered. It meant the story had matured, even if it never resolved. Within law enforcement, the case influenced procedure in ways that never made the news. Plainclothes stops were discouraged. Identification standards tightened. Dispatch protocols changed. making verification easier for drivers who felt unsure. These adjustments weren't admissions of failure. They were acknowledgments of vulnerability, the system learning where it could be bent. Late one evening, a letter arrived at the cold case unit, handwritten and signed. It referenced a location investigators recognized immediately, not as a discovery, but as a possibility they had debated for years. The letter contained no confession, no coordinates, just a phrase that suggested proximity, not precision. It could have been a cruel hoax. It could have been a test. It could have been nothing. Still, it was logged, analyzed, treated with the same seriousness as everything else that touched this case. Searches followed, discreet and limited. Again, nothing definitive surfaced. The letter joined the archive of almosts, of near misses, of things that hover just outside certainty. Investigators felt the familiar frustration rise and then subside. They had learned how to carry it without letting it erode them. As the man aged, his health declined in predictable ways. With decline came reflection, but not necessarily remorse. He spoke more freely about the past, but always in hypotheticals, always at a distance. He described scenarios as if analyzing someone else's mistakes, offering insights without ownership. Those listening understood the strategy. Confession would collapse the last boundary he controlled. The case file grew thicker even as its center remained hollow. Notes about policy impact, about public perception, about changes implemented because of one disappearance that refused to be simple. In this way, the woman's absence continued to shape the world, not through resolution, but through influence. On Florida roads, the night looked much the same as it had in 2001. Heat, asphalt, lights stretching into the distance. But beneath that familiar surface, something had shifted. People asked questions now. Officers explained themselves more clearly. The choreography of compliance had been rewritten subtly, permanently. And still, the question remained unspoken but ever present. Somewhere, in a place altered by time and intention, there might be an answer waiting. Or there might not. The case had taught everyone involved to accept uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. Cold cases don't always end with discovery. Sometimes they end with vigilance, with systems adjusted, with memory preserved, with the knowledge that silence can be challenged even when it can't be broken. And so the story continued, not as a chase, not as a trial, but as a quiet reckoning that refused to let a single night in 2001 fade completely into the dark. Time has a way of dulling urgency without ever erasing consequence, and by the time the case entered its third decade, it existed in two parallel states at once. On paper, it was resolved. In reality, it remained unfinished, a narrative with a verdict but no ending. A solved cold case that still carried the weight of something missing. That contradiction followed everyone who touched it, like a low-frequency hum you only notice when the room goes quiet. Inside the prison, the man marked time differently now. Days were measured by routine, by medication schedules, by the slow recalibration of a body that had outlived its own secrets. He was no longer the figure from grainy photographs or courtroom sketches. He was smaller, older, but what hadn't changed was the way he spoke about control. It slipped into conversations unintentionally, woven into metaphors about systems and order, about how chaos invites mistakes. Those listening understood the subtext. Control had always been the point. Investigators revisited those conversations repeatedly, not because they expected a breakthrough, but because language betrays thought patterns over time. He spoke of the past less defensively now, but also less concretely. Names disappeared from his vocabulary. Places became vague. Events dissolved into concepts. It was as if he were sanding down memory itself, smoothing edges that might cut him if handled too closely. Confession, in his mind, wasn't relief. It was erosion. Outside, the case continued to shape decisions in unexpected places. Law schools used it as a study in circumstantial construction. Psychology programs dissected the exploitation of authority. Journalism courses pointed to it as an example of restraint, of how not all truth arrives with spectacle. The story spread, not loudly, but persistently, influencing fields that had never met the woman whose absence had sparked it all. Her family aged into a quieter kind of advocacy. They stopped giving interviews every year. They chose moments carefully, conserving energy for when it mattered most. They learned to speak about her in the present tense, not as denial, but as refusal to let time redefine her worth. She wasn't a victim frozen in 2001. She was a person whose life extended beyond the moment she disappeared, even if no one could see where it went. Occasionally, investigators were asked the question they could never fully answer. Do you think he'll ever talk? The responses varied, but the truth underneath remained consistent. People like him don't confess because confession hands power to someone else. Silence keeps the final move. Even behind bars, even stripped of freedom, control can survive in what is withheld. Then, unexpectedly, the landscape shifted again. A routine infrastructure project required excavation near one of the locations that had hovered on the edge of suspicion for years. Not a site identified by the anonymous letter, not a place highlighted in court, just an area that had always felt possible without ever becoming probable. Protocol demanded oversight. An investigator was present not out of expectation, but obligation. No one spoke of hope. They had learned better. What emerged wasn't immediate clarity. It was anomaly. Soil that didn't match surrounding layers. A disruption inconsistent with natural settling. Small indicators that something had changed there once, long ago. Work paused. Specialists were called. The process unfolded slowly, deliberately, without the frenzy that had defined earlier searches. This time, patience was the strategy. Fragments surfaced. Not enough to announce anything. Not enough to identify anyone. But enough to force a decision. The site was sealed. The analysis expanded. News traveled carefully, controlled. Released only when necessary. The family was notified before anyone else. They listened in silence, understanding the language of caution too well to mistake it for promise. Forensic work took months. Each step required restraint. Expectations were managed tightly. The remains, if that's what they were, had endured years of environmental change. Time had not preserved them kindly. Identification would not be swift. It might not be possible at all. Still, the process continued, because process itself was an act of respect. Inside prison walls, the man heard rumors before facts. Inmates talk. Guards talk. Stories mutate quickly. Observers noted a change in his behavior almost immediately. Restlessness. Disruption of routine. Questions asked too casually. He denied knowing anything, but denial wasn't the point. Reaction was. Something in the outside world had shifted, and he felt it. When investigators approached him, they didn't confront. They informed. They spoke of developments without detail, of possibilities without accusation. They watched closely as he absorbed the information. His expression tightened. Not fear. Calculation. He asked one question only. Had anything been confirmed? The answer was no. Not yet. That was enough. The family waited. Waiting had become a skill. They prepared themselves for every outcome at once, knowing that certainty, if it arrived, would hurt no matter its shape. Closure is a word people use when they don't understand grief. What they wanted wasn't closure. It was truth. Or at least proximity to it. As weeks stretched into months, the excavation faded from headlines, replaced by newer crises. But within the case, everything had slowed to a careful crawl. No announcements were made. No conclusions drawn. The fragments remained fragments, resistant to easy interpretation. Still, something had changed. The possibility of a physical answer had moved from theoretical to tangible. The case had shifted again, not toward resolution, but toward grounding. Toward a place, a site, a piece of earth that might finally hold what memory could not. And as the investigation pressed forward with renewed caution, one thing became clear to everyone involved. Whether the remains proved conclusive or not, whether the truth ever fully surfaced or remained partly submerged, the silence that had protected the case for so long was thinning. Not breaking. Thinning. And in that thinning space, between what was known and what was still withheld, the story edged closer to its final reckoning. The waiting became its own discipline, a careful suspension of breath that stretched across weeks and then months, marked not by announcements but by updates delivered in measured tones. The fragments recovered from the site were transferred quietly, logged, cataloged, treated not as discovery but as responsibility. Every step forward risked misinterpretation. Every pause risked eroding trust. Investigators chose restraint again, the only posture that had ever kept this case intact. The lab was cold in the way places dedicated to truth often are. Temperature regulated for preservation, for precision, for the slow work of separation and comparison. Specialists examined what time had allowed to remain, searching not for drama but for pattern. Material composition. Environmental exposure. Microscopic indicators that suggested duration and movement. The questions were narrow now, technical, stripped of narrative. Did this belong here? Did it belong to her? Could it be dated? Could it be excluded? Results came in layers. Some answers arrived quickly, shutting doors that had never fully opened. Others lingered, ambiguous, requiring secondary analysis, peer review, repetition. The process resisted urgency. It demanded patience from people who had waited for decades. The family understood that better than anyone. They asked few questions. They prepared themselves for news that might finally anchor their grief, or scatter it again. While the science unfolded, investigators turned inward, auditing the case not for blame but for completeness. They reviewed every interview, every memo, every decision made since the verdict. They asked whether anything had been missed that could still matter, whether any path remained unexplored. Cold cases teach humility. They remind you that certainty is rare, and persistence is the only virtue that scales with time. Inside the prison, the man's routines fractured. He sought information without asking for it, lingering near televisions, reading between the lines of conversations that weren't meant for him. Observers documented the changes. Sleep disrupted. Appetite inconsistent. He spoke less about systems now and more about inevitability, about how things surface when they're ready. The phrasing mattered. It suggested acceptance without ownership, a psychological posture that preserved distance even as pressure mounted. Investigators approached him again, this time with specificity but without accusation. They referenced the site indirectly, described procedures, timelines, the slow nature of confirmation. They made no promises. They offered no leverage. They watched his reactions with clinical care. He listened. He nodded. He said nothing that could be used. Silence, once more, was his defense, and his final assertion of control. As forensic analysis continued, a secondary thread tightened. Financial records from the early 2000s were re-examined with contemporary tools. Small transactions, once insignificant, were flagged for context. A storage rental paid in cash. Supplies purchased in close succession. Nothing illegal on its own. Everything legal in isolation. But when layered against timelines and movements, the pattern suggested preparation followed by erasure. Not panic. Not improvisation. Intention. The prosecution team reconvened, not to reopen trial, but to plan contingencies. If identification proved possible, what would that mean legally? If it didn't, how would they communicate that without reopening wounds? They consulted victim advocates, forensic ethicists, people whose work existed precisely because truth and harm so often arrive together. The goal wasn't to win anything now. It was to honor process. The media sensed movement and pressed harder. Requests multiplied. Rumors spread faster than facts. Investigators responded with the same phrase, repeated until it lost all texture. The analysis is ongoing. For a public accustomed to closure packaged as certainty, the restraint felt unsatisfying. But restraint was the only thing that had prevented this case from collapsing into speculation. In the community, reactions were muted, thoughtful. People remembered the early frenzy, the way hope had surged and receded too many times to count. This time they waited differently. Fewer candles. Fewer statements. More quiet attention. The case had taught them that noise doesn't bring truth closer. When the preliminary report arrived, it was neither confirmation nor dismissal. It suggested consistency without conclusion. Compatibility without certainty. The fragments could not be excluded. They could not be definitively identified. Time had done what time always does, complicate. Investigators absorbed the report without visible reaction, already preparing for the next step, because ambiguity was not an endpoint. It was a direction. Advanced analysis was authorized. Comparative work expanded. Databases were consulted. Independent labs reviewed findings to guard against bias. Each layer added rigor, not clarity. And yet, even in uncertainty, something had shifted. The search had narrowed. The story had found a place to stand, even if it couldn't yet name what it held. The family was briefed in person. The language was careful, compassionate, exact. They asked one question at the end, the only one that mattered to them. Are we closer? The answer was honest. Yes. But closer does not mean close. They nodded. They had lived inside that distance for years. As autumn settled over Florida, the site was restored, marked discreetly, its significance known only to those who needed to know. The land returned to its surface purpose, carrying beneath it a history that might never be fully articulated. Places don't announce what they remember. They keep it. In prison, the man requested a meeting he had never requested before. Not with investigators. With a chaplain. The conversation was private, protected, and therefore inaccessible. But its timing was noted. Everything in this case had taught investigators to respect timing. The cold case, once solved on paper, now hovered in a liminal state again, neither fully resolved nor entirely open. It demanded a different kind of attention, one that accepted limits without abandoning pursuit. The story had lost its sharp edges and gained weight, settling into something heavier than mystery. And as the analysis continued, as patience replaced urgency yet again, one truth became unavoidable. Even if the final answer never arrived with certainty, the case had already exposed something fundamental. That trust, once exploited, leaves a residue that lingers far beyond verdicts, far beyond evidence, shaping behavior in ways that outlast any single story. The reckoning was not over. It had simply learned how to move more slowly. Winter stripped the landscape of distraction. Trees thinned. Colors faded. What remained felt closer to the bone, appropriate for a case that had spent decades shedding everything superficial. Investigators moved with the confidence of people who no longer needed momentum to justify their work. The case no longer chased an ending. It waited for one. The advanced forensic review concluded quietly. No press release. No language of triumph. The findings refined what was already known, tightening margins rather than breaking ground. The material could not provide absolute identification, but the probability curve bent decisively in one direction. Context, location, and compatibility converged. The science did not speak in absolutes, but it spoke clearly enough for those trained to listen. This was the threshold prosecutors had anticipated and feared. Enough to suggest truth, not enough to declare it without reservation. They convened again, this time with senior oversight, to decide what responsibility looked like when certainty stopped just short of proof. Reopening court proceedings risked failure. Doing nothing risked silence masquerading as justice. The decision was made to act carefully, outside the courtroom. A formal statement was drafted, stripped of emotion, precise to the point of austerity. It acknowledged new findings. It clarified limits. It affirmed conclusions reached years earlier while conceding what time had taken. No charges would change. No sentence would be revisited. But the record would now include what had once been missing. An explanation grounded in evidence rather than inference. The family received the news before anyone else. There were no cameras, no prepared remarks. Just a small room, a table, and words chosen to minimize harm. They listened. They asked questions that had no legal relevance but mattered more than any ruling. Could this have happened differently? Did she suffer? Was there anything left to find? Some questions were answered. Others remained beyond reach. The investigators did not pretend otherwise. What mattered was that the family was no longer being asked to imagine. They were being asked to accept something harder, but also more solid. In the days that followed, the community learned what it could, not through spectacle but through quiet reporting. The tone surprised people. There was no appetite for outrage anymore, no hunger for villains. Only a collective acknowledgement that some truths arrive incomplete, and that completeness is not the same as closure. Inside the prison, the man was informed through official channels. The update was procedural, unemotional. He read it once, then again. Observers noted no outburst, no denial. Only a long stillness. When asked if he wished to make a statement, he declined. He had always understood the power of withholding. Now it seemed more like surrender than strategy. A week later, he requested to amend an earlier interview record. Not to confess, not to explain, but to correct a minor detail about a date, a route, a time of day. The correction changed nothing legally, but investigators recognized it for what it was: an admission disguised as housekeeping, a final adjustment to a story he had tried, unsuccessfully, to control. The case file grew heavier with addenda, annotations, cross-references. It no longer resembled the lean uncertainty of its early years. It had become dense, layered, resistant to simplification. Exactly what cold cases often become when they survive long enough to tell the truth slowly. Plans were made to update the victim's memorial, not with new claims, but with context. A small plaque. A sentence acknowledging discovery without overstating certainty. Language mattered. The family approved every word. They had learned that words could wound as deeply as silence. As spring approached, investigators closed their internal review. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because there was nothing left that could be done responsibly. The case was no longer active. It was no longer dormant. It occupied a third category: resolved enough to rest, unsettled enough to remember. Training academies would study it. Not for its twists, but for its restraint. For the choices made when evidence whispered instead of shouted. For the discipline of waiting. The cold case had not ended with a revelation. It had ended with alignment between facts, probability, and human cost. A quieter ending than anyone had once imagined. But quieter did not mean weaker. It meant honest. The story did not end with a door closing. It ended with a room exhaling. Files returned to shelves. Evidence sealed not as secrets, but as artifacts of a pursuit that had finally learned when to stop pressing forward and start standing still. The Florida heat returned, indifferent to timelines, warming sidewalks that had once carried hurried footsteps and unanswered questions. Life moved. Memory stayed. The memorial was updated on a quiet morning. No speeches. No banners. Just a few people gathered long enough to watch a sentence become permanent. It did not claim victory. It did not promise certainty. It acknowledged discovery, time, and the stubborn persistence of truth even when it arrives fragmented. The family stood close together, closer than they had in years, as if the words had pulled them inward. They did not cry. They did not smile. They nodded once together, and that was enough. For investigators, the case shifted into a different register. It became something they carried rather than chased. In lectures and late-night conversations, they spoke about restraint, about the danger of forcing conclusions to satisfy an audience that would never sit in the room where doubt lived. They spoke about the traffic stop, the ordinary moment that had cracked a sealed timeline, and how routine encounters sometimes rearrange history without announcing themselves. The phrase cold case lost its chill here. It felt warmer now, closer to human temperature. The years had not frozen the truth. They had preserved it until the world was ready to hear it without demanding a spectacle. That readiness had taken decades. The man remained where he had been for years. No transfer. No change in sentence. The update did not alter his days, but it altered his posture. Guards noticed it first. The way he stood longer at the window. The way he stopped correcting people when they used the victim's name. The way he declined appeals that might have reopened questions better left untouched. Control had always been his currency. Letting go of it seemed, at last, inevitable. There was no confession. There never would be. The case did not need one anymore. Confessions satisfy a hunger for symmetry. This story had learned to live without symmetry. It accepted imbalance as the cost of surviving time. Journalists wrote their final pieces carefully. The headlines were restrained, almost apologetic. No single line could hold what the case had become. Readers noticed the tone and paused. Some expected fireworks and found quiet instead. Others found the quiet more unsettling than any revelation. The shock was not in what was discovered, but in how long it had waited, how patiently it had allowed everyone else to catch up. In the community, stories resurfaced, not theories but memories. A gas station that stayed open late. A streetlight that flickered for years and was finally replaced. A neighbor who always said hello and then moved away. The case had woven itself into ordinary life so deeply that removing it felt impossible. It did not leave. It softened. Time passed in a way it never had before. Without the pressure of pursuit, days felt less crowded. The absence of urgency revealed something else. Grief that had been deferred, anger that had been postponed, relief that did not know where to go. People learned, slowly, to hold those feelings without naming them. The cold case had been solved, the record would say. Not solved like a puzzle snapped into place, but solved like a storm passes, leaving debris, clarity, and a different landscape. The routine traffic stop that shocked investigators did not deliver a cinematic ending. It delivered a reckoning with limits. With what evidence can do. With what it cannot. On the anniversary, there were no ceremonies. Just a few lights left on longer than usual. A radio station played the same song it always did at that hour. Somewhere, a patrol car rolled through an intersection without incident. The officer inside unaware of the weight carried by that simple continuity. The voice of the case faded not into silence, but into resonance. It lingered in training manuals in cautious language, in the pauses investigators now allowed themselves before drawing lines between facts. It taught patience without promising reward. It reminded everyone involved that justice does not always arrive loudly, and truth does not always arrive whole. What remained was not a question demanding an answer, but a presence asking to be remembered accurately. No embellishment. No erasure. Just the facts, aligned as carefully as time allowed, and the people who lived with them. The story ended where it began, in ordinary motion, interrupted just enough to matter. A road. A stop. A life intersecting another without warning. The shock was never the revelation. The shock was that it took so long to understand what had been there all along. And even now, long after the files were closed, the case continued its quiet work, teaching those who listened how to sit with uncertainty, how to honor truth without demanding perfection, and how to let a mystery rest without letting it disappear.